All right, good people. We are back at it again with the white vans. So I'm super excited to just kind of come back to the table with y'all. It's been a minute, and I know that y'all missed me. I missed y'all too. Uh, and we got some more stuff to go. We got some new milestones to hit, new mountains to climb. But I just want to make sure we wrap up this conversation that we've started about the front end by just talking through React a little bit more and ensuring that we kind of understand those fundamental concepts that really are all that you need to know in order to start building out your front ends in React. And so for the last few sessions, we've talked a lot about the React library. We built a couple different applications, some very simple, some more complex, like the last one we were just working on. But all the while, we've been learning about a couple concepts that really make the style of how you code in React. And what I want to do today is just touch on those topics once more so that we kind of get it back in our brain, and then introduce you to some of the more, I guess you could say, intermediate concepts of React that are also equally as important to understand. And from there, I think we'll be in a great place to put a bow on everything we've been talking about here and start preparing to chat about how we move from React into the back end, right? And so building a whole full stack application with React as our front end. So if you're excited for where we at, where we're going, just give me a thumbs up so I know y'all rocking with me. That's also my sign that y'all here, attentive and listening to your boy, you know what I'm saying? So appreciate that. All right, cool. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull up that application that we worked on before, but also I'm going to pull up the React documentation just so we can take a look at both of those things. So first, we'll start with just a little review of those two resources. So I just noticed that the React team published the beta documentation. So remember I told you that there was old docs and then there were these new beta documentation that they were working on for a while. And it looks like they just recently went live with their new changes to the React website. So it looks like if you were to type reactjs.org in here, it kind of redirects you to react.dev, which must mean that this is the new site that they want us to use to organize our getting started and documentation for learning React. So that's cool. Shout outs to the React team for doing that. In the new docs, let's see if they still have some of those very cool resources that they had before. They do, but they also changed it. So, okay. So the docs have changed a little bit. It would take a little, some time to kind of walk through it all, but essentially, there are a couple core elements of React that whenever you're starting to build out your components that you need to know. And we've touched on all of them so far, right? So one of the biggest things you need to understand when we're working with React is JSX, right? And JSX is the JavaScript markup language that we use to create the code that becomes the visual elements of our web pages. So give me a thumbs up when I say JSX. You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm saying? You know, if you know what I mean when I say JSX, you welcome to the club, fam. Welcome to the club. Y'all here. You know what I'm saying? You're the club now, you know? So yeah, JSX is essentially that HTML looking syntax that we use in our JavaScript files in order to create our components, right? Components, that's another big common term in React. So if you understand the idea of components, great for you. Components are essentially a collection of JSX elements that we can call as one object, if you will, in different parts of our code, in different files. So we create files to structure our components, and those components we can call at different points in the code. So components, right? JSX components. The next big concept in React that we've talked a lot about that you also have to just kind of be privy to is props, right? So give me a thumbs up if you understand when I say props, you have something in your mind. You're like, oh yeah, props. Yeah, that's that thing. Right? So props definitely are a way of creating the ability for us to send and transfer data from component to component. And so we use props pretty commonly in our applications in order to ensure that the right data is getting sent to our components at different moments in time. Then the last big thing that we talked about that is vital to understand the React data flow is state. And state is the ability for us to, internal to a component, keep track of data that's going to change. And when that data changes, we can recreate that component based on the change in the data. So between JSX, components, props, and state, those are really the four big things of working with React that make up our ability to build applications like this one, right? So you remember this was our little What's Up app that we started a while back in order to kind of talk about some of these core concepts, right? So in the code here, which we'll take a look at in a quick second, we can see a lot of those different elements there, right? First, we have this nice little component welcome-ish screen, right? And as the user interacts with our application, they thereby change the state. And in changing the state, we were able to do certain things like render new components that weren't previously in the app, right? So when I click login, right, I can see this dashboard component. Whereas if I were to click sign up, I could see this secondary component, and each kind of return their own information, right? Some of what y'all started working on was the next step, right? Which is, okay, well, what if I, for instance, fill out a form and then I want to send data from one component to another component, right? And that is a lot of what that last application that we started working on as part of our last session that is meant to kind of demonstrate the ways in which prop, state, and different components work together in order to send and receive this data. So let's take a look at the code here and just kind of refamiliarize ourselves with this code, maybe clean it up a little bit, add some things that might make some of those other aspects of what we were just talking about easier to understand, right? So cool. So I'm going to just switch over to VS Code for now, and let's just take a look at the code as it kind of stands, right? So remember, whenever you're working with React, especially create React app library-based applications, you want to look at the source folder to understand the component hierarchy of what's going on in here. In the source folder, we have the app.js, which is our main entry point into our React components. And the app.js will always demonstrate what is the most important components that are being rendered at for the application to work as we expect. In our app.js right now, we have a couple things going on. We have basically, if you remember, what we did was we created a function called render page that does a little bit of conditional rendering. And what I mean by conditional rendering is this function has like conditional logic built into it that determine which component will show at any point in time. The way that it does this is it uses the state of the application to determine, hey, based on the state, I want to show X, Y, or Z, right? So if the state of the app shows that the button has been clicked and the user's trying to log in, well, then we're going to return the login component. Else, if the state is showing that the user's trying to sign up, well, we're going to click this. We're going to show them the sign up component, right? Otherwise, we're going to show them just some default JSX that represents, we could represent this as its own component, but we haven't done that yet. All three of those cases are tied to the value stored in the state. And the state, remember, is essentially data internal to the component that can be changed at different points in time, right? So when I say data internal to the component, I mean the app.js, right? The app component has a state that it is keeping track of. It's keeping track of the state of which button was being clicked, right? And we use the use state hook in order to create that ability for us to monitor the state at different points in time. So the app now has kind of like a brain tied to this data point. And it's saying, okay, cool, I'm keeping track of this button that's being clicked. And as it's being clicked, I will be able to set the value of that data so that anywhere else in the app that I need to use this data, I can refer back to it using this variable here. So we were able to do our conditional rendering because we're keeping track of that data and saying, hey, based on what that data value is, I'm going to show a different component at a different moment in time. And if that value is not set at all, well, we're going to just return this default bit of elements that we want to show the user to get them started on the right flow. So that's the state, right? And state is a very important aspect to the component's life cycle because it's data that the component itself can change about itself. And I know that sounds probably pretty like, what did he say? But I say it again in the same way. Essentially, state is data that the component can change within itself. It can change the component knows about the state, it knows the data that's in there, but it can also change that data. And it has that ability to change the data and thereby change what it's showing at different moments in time. This is unlike props, which are data that get passed into a component by another component. And the component that receives the props can't change the value of the prop it received. It just can call it. It's a constant value in that regard. You can't change the prop. So in this case, right, we have an example of props in how we passed and created these buttons originally, right, where we had these buttons and each button essentially created a different, each button has a different value for its text, as well as essentially will return this callback function whenever it gets clicked. So if we go ahead and look at the my button component that we created a while ago, that component, as you might recall, has two values in props that it uses to make itself work. The first is the text that get passed in order to return a button with that particular text, right? This makes our component a little bit more reusable because instead of having to create a bunch of buttons, we could just create one button, pass the text in there, and that component can show what it needs to show. Secondly, we use the on button click prop that we created in the parent. So the app.js created this prop called on button click, and it's passing in this function called notify click status into the button. The reason we did this was so that the button, when it was clicked, could let the parent know, hey, I was just clicked and here's some data, right? And so by calling props.onButtonClick, we are actually calling this function, notify click status, that we defined up here, which is what the app used in order to set the state and make all of these changes possible. And so whenever that function in the button gets called, it actually triggers this function in the app to be called, which thereby sets the state. And when this state changes, right, when button click changes, the component, whenever the state changes, the component looks at the change and says, okay, I saw the state change. I'm going to re-render. I'm going to render myself again. Basically, I'm going to look at what I'm supposed to show. And if anything needs to change, I'm going to show the change, right? So whenever the state updates, the component will update. That's something very important to understand. So because the state updates, right, it means that render page is going to get called again and again and again. Because if you look at how the component gets returned, the only thing it returns is this function that renders the page. So if the component needs to re-render and show itself again, it's going to run this same line over and over again, which means that render page is going to get called each time the state gets changed, which means that in render page, right, because we're looking at the state as a data point, right, and using this conditional logic, that's what allows our application to then show one component versus another component. This whole flow is built in the way that the data that the component knows or a component has saved in state determine what the view of the rest of the application is. And we have a secondary component that is responsible really for changing the state of the first component. So I know that these concepts can be a little bit tough to understand at first because they are maybe unfamiliar, but trust me when I say that this pattern of designing components and sending data between components is a very common process that we use in React. So it's one of those things that while it might feel unfamiliar right now, over time, you're going to have so many more examples of the same process being done that you'll eventually understand, okay, cool. In this case, I need some props to be passed, or hey, I need to save something in state. I need state to update so that the component can update. Those things will become a lot more clear. And a little bit of my goal right now is to kind of just continue to talk about this, maybe clean this up a little bit, and build this out in a way that can demonstrate this even further. So right now, if we take a look at our application, it's kind of interesting, right? We have this login component, we have this sign up component, and we want the ability to essentially really create this like messenger like system, right? So when you log in, right, it's cool to see this list of messages, but it would be even better if like maybe I can create a message and we could see that get added into this list here, right? So let's do that, because I think that it'll be a great demonstration of some of the same concepts that you probably were working on in that last assignment, which is building a system for having one component talk to another component. One is visual, one is functional, and we're trying to get the data to connect. And hopefully in seeing this in this example, it makes this a little bit more clear. And then once we get there, maybe we'll tie this up a little bit nicer and see what we can do toward the end to make the application a little bit more practical for ourselves. So cool, let's make this happen. So what I'm gonna do is first, let me just show y'all this, right? So this is that dashboard. So it would be great if we could create maybe some way for us to input some strings and have that tied to these messages and kind of add to this list of data that we have here. So I think having that logic will allow us to create a little bit more details in our flow here. So let's go back to the app. What I want to do first is take a look at the app one more time and look at this kind of component structure that we have here. So right now we have the main application is calling render page. When render page is being called, it's taking a look at the state to determine which component do we want to show. And we're either going to show the login component or the sign up component, right? So the login component right now, right, we're not really doing any real authentication or anything, checking a password or any of that yet, but we're assuming that the user has the right credentials to log in. And when they do, they're getting presented with this dashboard component, right? So the dashboard component is actually the component that has these messages showing up, right? So the messages that we see in the application are actually all here as kind of hard-coded elements, right? So what I'm suggesting is, instead of this all being hard-coded, what if we make this application a little bit more intelligent and able to be updated in a dynamic capacity, right? So what I'm imagining, right, and I do a nice little quick little strategic plan for myself, right? Just give myself some thoughts on like how I want to approach this, right? Well, the thing is, I want to have some form, a form component that takes in new messages, right? And then I want to have some kind of like message list, right? That shows all the messages, right? So right now we have this like kind of working like a message list, but maybe we want to structure this out a little bit better, right? So the form will just take in new messages. That's where we kind of just say, hey, we're going to create a new message. The message list will be like the view of all of those messages. Give me a thumbs up if you get what I'm saying, because you know, ain't nothing like somebody hacking it. You don't know what they talking about. You know what I'm saying? All right, I got 3 people. They're like, okay, I get you. I got 7 people. All right. 8 people. Okay. All right. I think we're good now. I think we're Gucci. All right, good. All right, cool. So I want to kind of make this app a little bit smarter so we can add messages to the list, essentially. So here's what I'm gonna do. First things first, well, I know I need these two components. So first thing I'm gonna do is just create those two components real quick. So form.js, and I want to create a message list.js. Dope. And in the form.js, we'll start there by just creating a new component. So I'll just say const form, create a nice little arrow function. And remember, all these components are responsible for doing is returning some JSX. We talked a little bit about forms. We actually have some of that logic in the signup, where we talked about the form HTML element being a element that we can use to create forms. So I'm gonna just render a super simple form right here for now, and then export default form so that we have that ability to pull this in to our dashboard. So now I should be able to go to the top, import form from form, and cool. So now I should be able to have this component demonstrate, show the stuff that I needed to see, right? So cool. So in a second, let's say we have this div. This is my dashboard. Here are our messages. I like that, but maybe what I want to do is create that form here. So there, create that form so we can see it also render inside of this div as well. So save this, and then I'm going to just take a quick glance back at the app, make sure nothing broke. Doesn't look like anything broke, but we don't see the form, mostly because we don't have any elements in there. So what I want to do is switch back over to VS Code, and let's just make one quick element in there so that we can see, just make sure that the form is rendering as we expect it to. So just kind of go ahead and do this. And for now, I'm just going to put input, and I don't need this actually. Input, let's say type text. And that should be enough to get something visual on the screen. Let's take a look. All right, boom, cool. So we got this nice little input box. So that's great. So at least we know the form is showing up. We'll add some more stuff to this in a second. What I want to do now is add this message list component, create this message list component so that we can also show this messages in a more sophisticated way, other than just these messages as they kind of currently stand. So what I will do here is I actually want to make use of an HTML element I don't think we particularly talked about yet. So it's funny because these are all very common HTML elements and just helpful to know. So the one that we can use, right? There's a couple different ones. We could use a table. We could use a list. I'm trying to decide, should I use a table and help y'all out? Or should I use a list and not help y'all out? I'm gonna use a table. I'll use a table. I'm like, okay, let me just use the table. So I'll make so what I'm gonna do is back in the code, I'm gonna create a new component. Let's call it message list, and just make this nice and beautiful component. And again, all this component needs to do in order to be usable is return something. So I said that I want to make this one a table, so I'll just make this a table. And right now, I think if I save this, we're not actually going to see anything. Well, there's a number of reasons we're not going to see anything. We got to export it first. Export the message list, save that, go back to our young dashboard, and what we will do is import this at the top. So import message list. message list. And then we're gonna just replace this div of elements here and show the message list. And just so I can show something right now for the time being, I'm just gonna actually, instead of just returning the empty table, we'll put this in a table in a second, but I just wanna make sure I see everything I expect. So I'm gonna just pull this, this div with the messages in here. But of course, in order for this to work, I need to import the message at the top so that this component knows about the message that we're referring to. So I'll say message from / message, right? Because we already have a message component, and that component is really just a little div with some heading and a paragraph, right? And it's taking in some props. So here in the message list, this should hard code our thing. I'm just gonna change this hello from the message list. Save this, and yeah, once again, let's take another look at this app. And cool, so we got hello from the message list. We got these other messages showing up. We still got the little form input in there. So all's well in that vibe right there. So now we might want to build out our form a little bit more, build out this form, build out everything kind of to make it so that we can actually start adding messages to this message list, right? So let's go back to our code into the form, right? And so right now we have kind of a simple form. If we take a look at the signup .js, we have an example of like a full form, right? We have the form inputs. We can create labels with different inputs, tie those labels together. And we can also give the form a button that can get called whenever we want something to take place, right? So just for the sake of showing this off in this capacity, let's do something similar. So I'm just gonna actually paste this in here so we can reformat this. But let's say we have a label, and let's just say new message for the label. And then in the input, we're going to basically give this type text, which allows for the input to process text. I'll give it a name. Let's just call it new message. And then we need to pass some type of action handler. So whenever the input is being changed, we can keep track of the data that's being changed, right? So in the sign up, right, that was, we had a couple functions that we created that were responsible for, tracking which input was being changed and updated, and eventually updating that state and sending that data back to wherever we needed to send it. So similarly, we just want to create some type of action to basically keep track of the data as the data is being changed in the input, right? So as somebody is going in here and typing whatever their new message is, we want to be able to keep track of whatever they typed, right? And the reason we want to do that is so that we can use this data later to add it to this array of messages, or the soon to be array of messages. Whoops. So yeah, that's kind of where we are right now, right? So go back to the code. What we want to do is create this kind of event handling function. So all you need to remember is whenever you're working with forms, inputs, they have a particular event handling function called onChange that we can use to basically be notified whenever this input's data is being changed. What we want to do though is keep track of that data inside of this component. And because the data inside of this component is changing, the best case tool of React that we can use for this would be state or props. Drop it in the chat. If I want to keep track of data that's going to change inside of the component, which of the two would I want to use in order to keep myself in a good place? Let your boy know in the chat. That's a question for y'all. All right. See a couple people dropping that in there. Definitely, we want to use state. So we want to use state, and we want to use state in order to basically keep that data so that we can make use of it later. We can update the component with it, etc. So right now, in order to add state to any component, what I want to do is import the use state hook from React. And this is a pre-built function in the React library that allows us to create the necessary points of data that we need to keep track of the state and update the state. And essentially, all we got to do is add the use state hook into our component. So inside of the component declaration, we can create a new state value. So I'm going to say, let's say message, const message, set message, and we're going to give that equal to use state, and it's going to be an empty string right now. So this just means that, hey, you know, we have a message, there's no real text in there yet, but eventually we'll have one, right? So right now, as the input is being changed, what do we want to do? Well, technically, we want to set the message that we're saving in our state to be the same value as whatever the input is currently saved as, right? So as the input has data changing, we want our state to mirror the data that the input has, right? So what we want to do is essentially give the input the same, make it so that the input has that, the data that the input is being updated with is being saved in the state. So like y'all already know, what we would typically do is create a function that we would create and pass in here to be responsible for maybe like handle message change or something, right? And this would be a function, and this function would be responsible for you know, essentially at one point setting the message to be, you know, something else, right? Well, we can create this external function just like this. That's true. But I also want to introduce you to some other common ways you'll see programmers building their code in JavaScript, especially. And so we can pass functions as data in JavaScript. So sometimes instead of creating an entirely new function and, you know, taking up lines of code here, what you might see people do is a similar thing, but inside of the JavaScript expression here. So what that might look like is someone creating a new function that has really no name, right? So right now, if you can imagine, this is just an empty arrow function, right? If we look up here, this is an arrow function, but this arrow function was set to a value, right? In this case, we just have the function. It's not set to, it doesn't have a name, it just is a function. But we can pass data into this function the same way, right? And so sometimes you'll see people just write their function here, right? So if I wanted to alert the user that, you know, we changed, or like maybe like input changed or something, right? I could just pass this function in like this. And then when I start typing into this, when I start typing into this, we get this nice alert that the input changed, right? So that's just a common design thing that you'll see some folks in the JavaScript landscape use their what we call anonymous functions to basically just write a function in line with this code, right? So give me 1 sec, fam, and I'll get to your question, or you could drop it in the chat and I'll try to address it quicker. But essentially, what we want to do, we don't want to alert the user that the input changed. We just want to set the state to be something different, right? So essentially what I want to do is call set message, and I want to pass some data in here that essentially is going to save this data in our state, right? Well, where's this data going to come from? Like, what is this data where are we going to get this data? Well, you got to remember that whenever you are using these event handling functions, on change, on click, on drag, whichever, all of those functions come back with a event object that we can make use of to understand more data about the event that transpired. So the event object, and I'll just put this here and console.log this real quick so we can take a look at it. The event object is a very important object in JavaScript that we use in order to have some insight on, we use it to have insight on what, oops, my bad. We use it to have insight on what events are happening at different points in time, right? So if I were to go in here and I would say, testing the input, right? Right now, inside of the console, you can see there's a bunch of events being fired. What we see here is coming back from form.js 18. One thing that's really helpful about the console is it'll show you where these logs are coming from so that you can go ahead and take a look at your code and say, okay, form.js 18, okay, cool. So clearly what we're console logging is that event, right? And the event object has a number of different data points on it that allow for us to get a better sense of what's going on in that input, or what's going on in that event at different points in time. One of the most helpful parts of the event object happened to be the target, which shows you which element is responsible for triggering the event. So let me just go over here so you can see this. It shows you which element was responsible for triggering the event. So right now, if I were to scroll down to target, right? So clearly it's highlighting that input. So we know that this input was the thing that triggered this event, right? But the target also comes back with some really dope information like value that shows you the value of the input at that particular moment in time. So we can use the target.value in order to get back the data that we need to know from this particular input as to what is the various message at that point in time, right? So the idea is that you can use the input in the event handler to understand what is the data that I need to have at this point in time, right? So whoops, my bad. So we go back to the to our code right quick, right? So clearly, like I said, if we were to just kind of take a look at event.target.value, we're going to get back the information that we expect is in the input here. So if I say, this is my message, right? And we take a look at the console one more time. I gotta scroll to the bottom, right? So here, this is my message, form.js 18, right? So that means that this console log event.target.value is clearly mirroring what we see is inside of the input box here. So cool. So we have a way of getting that data. So all we need to do now to finish this up is to set the message, which is going to set the state to be tied to our event.target.value, right? So you might be seeing this, you might be like, well, Cam, why don't we just use event.target.value? Why do we got to use the state in the first place, right? Well, the reason why is because this event.target.value doesn't exist anywhere except inside of this little function right now, right? So once this function ends, we're not going to have any reference to this data anymore. So in order to keep a reference to this data, we have to save it somewhere. And the only way we can save it with relationship to the way that components are structured is saving it in our state. Which will allow us to make use of it in other parts of our component as well, as we'll see in a second. So basically now, by setting the message here, we have a value for our state for the first time. So that's great. All we're missing now in our logic of this form and whatnot is essentially maybe something to make it so that we can submit this new message, right? So let me just do this, add this, and inside of our form, let's add one more input. We're going to give it a type submit and a value of, let's just say submit, and close this off. And what we see here is we're going to get a nice little submit button that will be perfect for, hey, type our message, submit it, and we would expect to see it here at the bottom, right? So cool. So all we want to do now is make it so that whenever we click submit, we are able to take that message, right? And essentially what we want to do is take that message and then add it to our message list. So a lot of the logic in our form is kind of done, right? We have the ability to take the message, we have it set and state. Now we just need some way of making it so that when the form button gets submitted, we can keep track of this message and send it to our message list, right? So for now, let's just handle the case of the user submitting the form, right? So if we use the input submit, then the best way for you to create this event handler is to actually create a event handler on your form, where you can create a similar event handler to like on change, but it's called on submit. And on submit is essentially another event that gets thrown whenever the form sees that the submit button was actually clicked. So in this case, when the submit button gets clicked, again, we want some function to take place. So instead of creating a new function up there that I don't really care about, I'm just going to create one in line like this. And essentially this function on submit is going to run whenever the form gets submitted, right? So what do I want to have happen? Well, eventually, right, I want to send send the message to the message list, right? But we got to figure out how we're going to do that. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create an alert, and I want to just show the message so we can see it. So I'm going to just pass the message as data in the alert. One other thing that I want to do is the way that forms work when you submit them is it causes the page to reload. So in order to stop the page from reloading, what I'm going to do is call this event object in here, and I'm going to call the function event prevent default, which is a function that essentially stops the page from reloading every time the form gets submitted. This will allow us to actually run the code that we see here. So we'll save this, go back to our nice little form. This is my message. That's fine. Let's just submit. And oh, don't see anything there, but you know what I'm saying? Let's just make sure that that's how it's supposed to be. This is a test. Submit. Okay, cool. It actually is showing up. This is a test. Dope. All right, bet. So we have this form component pretty wired up, right? Everything's going Gucci here. But what we want to do is figure out how we're going to send this message to the message list, how we're going to show it in the message list, right? And so here, this is where we got to get back into understanding how does the data work in React, right? So clearly we have some data here in the form, but the message list is here in this other component, and it's showing this like kind of hard-coded list of messages right now. Well, how can I get this data from one component to another component, right? This is a question for y'all in the chat. What's the way, if I want to get data from one component to another, no matter what the case is, no matter what the circumstances is, what do I need to use if I want to get data from one component to another component? It's one word, it starts with a P. It actually has two P's in it.
Prop?
Yeah, props, exactly. Exactly, right? So whatever the case is, whenever I want one component to get data from another component, I need to use props. That's it. There's no other way, right? So the question is, how am I going to use props for the form to get the data to the message list, right? Well, where do props get defined is the first thing we got to think about. Where do I, so like, let's assume that I have props coming from the message list. And let's assume that in that props is like an array of messages, right? Maybe I have like an array of, maybe I have an array of messages in here, right? Maybe it's like props.messages or something, right? Well, okay, that would be great. And then maybe I can map through those messages or something, like show them really creatively or whatnot, right? Well, that would be dope. But right now, I don't really even know how we're going to get the props in here, right? Because where does the props for message lists actually get defined? Well, if you remember, props are always defined at the level of when a component is getting declared, right? So here, this message component, right? The message list is the parent component of the message, right? All these messages. And these messages are being passed some props, right? So when we create the component and we say we're going to render this component, right? We can pass the props at that point, which means that if I want to pass the props for the message list, if I want to pass any props into this, I can only do it in the dashboard because this is where the message list component is actually getting rendered. Give me a thumbs up if you understand what I'm saying. Just like in the message list, if I want to pass props to each message, I had to do it where I'm calling the message. If I want to pass props into the message list, I have to do it where the message list is being declared as well. This is a very important concept here for understanding how the props, how props work. Dope. So that means if I want to pass messages, I'd have to declare it here somewhere, right? And, pass some data here somewhere. So I need the data to be passed here. Well, that's cool, but the form has the data that I want to show. So technically, how am I going to get the data from inside of the form back to, I guess, the dashboard, and then finally down to the message list, right? This, I swear, is a common problem and use case that you're going to have when you're working with your components. And the answer is you have to, whenever you have a situation where you want one component that is a sibling to another component to basically share the data, like I want the form to give the data to the message list, I have to use the parent component to pass the data down to the other sibling. So essentially, the form has to talk to the dashboard, and the dashboard is going to talk to the message list for us, right? And the way we can do this is all through props. So essentially, what we're going to want to do is pass some type of function to the form that says, hey, whenever you receive a new message, whenever a new message is submitted, right, I need you to let me know, notify me, and I will notify the message list, right? So it's almost as if we say like, notify new message, right? And this is a function, and boom, we walk to the end of BAM, right? And this function is a function let's just rename this new message notification. I think is kind of cool, right? So basically, we want this function to be called whenever the form submits a new message, right? So okay, that's great, and I want the form will pass back the message. So that means that this function will receive some data, like a message from the form, right? How we structure this is we use props in order to tell the form, hey, on submit, or like, on message, or maybe like on new message or something, right? And then we pass this function in so that it gets called whenever this on new message prop gets called, right? So all we got to do now is go back to our form, right? And essentially where we were originally just alerting of the message, what I want to do is send the message to the message list. So I'm going to call props dot on new message, right? And I'm gonna pass the message in that we are already saving in the state, right? We already got the message. We already got it when we submitted it, right? Now we just want to send it back to, well, right now we want to send it to the message list through the dashboard, right? So we're sending this actually back to our dashboard, right? And our dashboard is going to get this function. And when it gets called, right, we're going to have the message here, which is great, because if the dashboard has the message, well, that means that we can actually send this message down to our message list, right? So essentially what I want to do is I want the dashboard to keep track of all of the new messages and to send those messages to our message list for it to use. And the best thing that I got to do in order to do this is to use state again, so that the dashboard can get updated with all of the state, with all of the messages that are that it's receiving from the form, right? So anytime the form sends us a message, we want to hold it, right? So I need the dashboard to have the data of what's being updated, and it needs to be able to update. So it needs to have some state to keep track of all this data. So in the dashboard, what I'm going to do is create a state object. So I'm going to say const messages, set messages, and I'm going to make this an array. And it'll start out as an empty array for now. But whenever we get a new message notification, right, what I want to do is update the array of messages with the new message, right? So basically, we have this array of messages, and I want to make sure that the array, that the state updates with this new array. So centrally, right, this array starts out empty, and I want to basically push this new value into that array. There's a couple of different ways we could do this, right? One way would be to create a temporary array. So let's say new messages, and then, you know, we could say this gets our old messages, right? And then here I could do something like new messages dot push, and then push the new message, right, that came back from this function. Matter of fact, let me just call this new message so it's easier to see, right? So new message. So new messages, we push the new message, right? And then eventually what I would want to do is set the messages, right? So set messages, remember, is the state function that is going to update the state. If the state is an array, that means set messages needs a new array in order to set the data here, right? And luckily we have this new array from new messages, right? So if I said new messages like this, right? Now we're setting the state to be a different or updated array, right? This array now is basically has all the value of the old array, but we added that new message to it, right? So this would be one way to do this, is to create a new array and then push the new value in there. So essentially, I'll keep it like this for now. I'm sure some folks might have thought about other ways that we could structure this, but essentially we're creating a new array, right? That array is getting all of the old messages to start, right, in this line 19. Then we're adding one new message to that array, and then setting the entire state to be this new messages array with the added one in there as well. So now all of this should allow us to keep track of all of the messages in this array. So I'll save this, and oh, there's this little tiny bug. But I guess you can imagine what we're going to do here is the message list needs some messages to show, right? So we happen to have a state value called messages. So I could say messages. It kind of feels a little, I don't really like when the prop and the data are the same, and it feels like really hard to understand whether it's the prop or the data. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to just call it message data here, and then just pass messages here, which means that inside of message list, instead of this being props.messages, it'll be props.message data. And cool. So now the message list is expecting a prop called message data, right? And we are passing that prop with the messages state that we created in the dashboard that's being updated by this function. That's being updated by this function that we are calling and passing into the form to allow us to know whenever there's a new message. So all of these things are basically connected. I guess now we can test it. Right now we only have kind of this console log happening though. So the last thing we're kind of missing is we don't want to just show these hard-coded messages. We actually want to show the array of message data. Like we want to kind of demonstrate all those messages that are actually the messages passed in from the array, right? So what I want to do instead of just kind of these hard-coded messages is I actually want to map and create the data more dynamically. So remember that arrays have a, like if I have an array, right, and it's just values, I can call a function called array.map. And array.map is essentially a function that will basically look at every element of the array and run some function in it and return a new element, a new array with a different element. So essentially, I can take this existing array of message data that we have, right, and turn it into an array of message JSX, which will allow us to render all of those messages dynamically, right? So how I would do that, because this is a JavaScript expression that I'm returning, I'm just gonna open some curly braces here, and I'm gonna say props.messageData.map, right? And this .map means that, hey, we're assuming this is an array. If anything gets passed in here that's not an array, we're going to get some errors, but we're going to assume that this is an array. And then again, the map function takes in another function. So here's the other function. That function has the opportunity to take two values in. One is just a value to represent each element of the array. So if we look back at our dashboard, right, each element of this array of messages will be able to be referenced in here. So let's just call it value. And then we also can pass the index number of that particular item in the array. So sometimes I like to keep both just because you might need to use the index, and we're definitely going to use it right here. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what are we going to map in return, right? You said that the map function basically looks at every element of an array and returns a new item in a new array of items based on whatever function we run. Well, all I want to do is, based on all of the values that we see, I want to take those values and return a new message component, right? Where the content is going to be set to value, right? And right now, because the author is me, I'm just going to hard code this part to say Cam. We're going to change this in a second. Right? So the author is Cam, but the message content will be the value coming back from our array in our dashboard, right? So just to kind of prove this point, I'm going to create a couple strings in here. I'm going to say testing our data, and I'm going to create another one that says, if this works, I'm going to screen. And I'm going to create another one, and I'll say, just kidding, it's Ramadan, and I ain't got the energy. I had to make myself laugh real quick. All right, cool. So we got this dashboard, right? We got some strings in here, right? Just 3 strings, right? So if you're following, this is an array of strings, right? But why is this array important? Well, this messages array of strings, this messages array is being passed instantly into our message list, right? The message list is we're taking that data, right? And right now we told the message list, take all that data and map over it. And for all of the elements inside of there, return a new message component with that data, right? I don't need this anymore. I'm just going to delete this for now. Save this, and let's go back to our props is not defined. Form 16.9. Well, that makes sense, right? I can't use a prop if I ain't define it here. So remember, if you want to use props inside of your component, you have to make sure you call it as a parameter up here. So thanks, compiler. And take a look at this. Cool. So now our component just re-rendered, right? And as you can see, the messages that showed up are those 3 messages from that array that I created, right? These are all hard-coded messages right now in the sense that I kind of pre-programmed them here in the dashboard, right? So if I added one more for the sake of education, right? This is coming back here as a new element because of the fact that the message data, right? Remember, this message's state is important because we're passing it to our message list. Without this message list getting this data, it wouldn't be able to then map over this content and show the correct component as we would expect, right? So that's great. Now let's test this other logic, right? Which is, can I add from the form, right? So theoretically, right, we already hooked this up. The form has its input. The input is tracking what we just typed. We saw that. It's setting the message. And then when we click the submit button, what we hope to happen is that the on new message function gets called with that message. On new message is actually calling this new message notification in the dashboard. That's going to take that new message, and it should take that array and add a new message to that array and then set the messages. So essentially setting these messages, right, remember, is changing the state. By changing the state, that means that this component, which is relying on that data, is going to get new data, one, but because the state is changing, the whole application will re-render because of that change. So drum roll, please. Can I add from the form? Ooh, can I? can I add from the form? I can't add from the form. There. It did that to me. Well, let's see what happened. Let's see what maybe made it so it didn't work. So wait, let's take a look here. So props on new message. We got the yeah, I know it's kind of like that, right? It's funny. You think you got it and then it don't work. So we got this props on new message with the message, and then inside of our dashboard, woo. New messages, push the new message. Set messages with the new messages. Message list, message data with the messages. And then in our message list, we're returning all of our stuff. I don't know, y'all. You know, sometimes the John be tweaking. Sometimes John be tweaking. Let me actually close the console for real quick and just refresh this. And let's go back here and just, can I add from the form? No. All right. Well, that's how it goes. Oh, maybe I think I saved my change. Yeah, I saved it. Awesome. Yeah, I saved it. So let's see. This is the part we get paid for. This is where we get paid the big bucks, right? So props on new message with our message. Okay, groovy. So then let's test this in our dashboard, right? On new message notification, we expect that this should be pushing this new message. So let's take a look here. Console log, new messages. Make sure that we're not creating any bugs here. Oh, and also this is a great opportunity for me to show y'all something else. Oh, that's wild. Maybe it's just my internet. I don't know. Maybe it's tweaking. That's weird. Well, whatever. Let's refresh and just make sure that that's not some random situation here. All right. Testing the form. And also let me pull up the console just cause. Okay. I can fix that in a second. Testing the form. Submit. Don't see anything there, but we get this array back and clearly it's here in the array. All right, so that's good. So that means that new messages is working. Set messages should be changing our state. and message list should be updating with that data. So why it's not doing this? um, Interesting. Do. Okay. Um, hmm. So then what I'll do is in the message list, let's take a look at the props. Just make sure console log props dot message data. Okay, so this should actually be still running when we let me do this. Say, okay, so message list JS4, we got both there, and then JS27, we have it as well. And interesting. Hmm. To be honest, y'all, I don't know why it's doing this. And I don't wanna impart a bad coding habit on y'all. But I don't want to take up your time just trying to debug what seems to be a pretty weird bug. But hopefully you see what I'm doing here, right? In terms of passing the data from the message data. Clearly we see that that's working because we're able to get back the data that we initially put here in our form, right? So clearly our structure is working. I don't know, I'd have to look a little bit deeper to see why the component is not updated with what's going on in here. So I'll look at that in a second. The biggest thing I wanted to show you though is that this flow and format of passing the data around is a key kind of design architectural thing that we do in React pretty often, right? Beyond this, right, one thing that also would be really dope is to be able to have the our data kind of saving, right? So that it's not like we're starting from scratch every time we are pulling up these messages, right? So let me try one thing just because I'm curious. I'm gonna stop the server and just restart it. I don't know. Sometimes funky stuff be happening. I don't know really what could be happening. So yeah, let me just restart the server. And beyond what we see here, I'll figure it out what's going on in there and let y'all know. But you know, you win some, you lose some when you code in. All right, so this is reloading, and when this finally reloads, what we're gonna do is go back to our login. Cool, we have these super test examples. Testing the farm again and again. Submit this. I don't see why it's doing this. Maybe there's something in my event handler for this form. Let's see. I like to keep alerts just to make sure things are working as I expect them to. All right. So then if that's working, then all right, I'm gonna have fun debugging that one for y'all. But the last thing that would be cool, and this is just a quick nod to some of y'all who maybe are already finished getting to this point with your own kind of build, right, is of course we want to start thinking about data persistence and keeping the data in a way that we can organize to draw back from later, right? And so in order to do that, right, we can actually make use of another JavaScript API that is very helpful for saving small bits of data locally on the computer. And that API is the local storage API. So if you're curious about, oh, like how could I save this? And then when I pull up the app again, I'm able to use the I'm able to keep that data in internal to my in my application, right? So local storage is an API in JavaScript that we can use. I tried to just find like a blog, but it seems like this is tweaking. Okay, but yeah, right here. I was trying to find the docs, but maybe this is cool too. Essentially, local storage has a couple of different methods that we can call in order to save items and get back items from local storage. And basically, local storage is storage that's saved in our locally on the computer browser, meaning that each site kind of collects, it's kind of like how cookies are stored on your browser, right? Like a web application might create a little bit of data that they save from your browse, from your interactions with the site, right? And local storage is one way that we can save some of that data on our side as well. So really it's very simple. The local storage API defines these different maybe these are the docs. These were the docs I was looking for. The local storage API basically allows us to use kind of key value pairs to store items and pull back items. The thing is that the items can only be strings, right? We can only save strings, and you only can save it's not like a huge string can be saved there, right? So but for the most part, this is a great use case for when you want to save some data quickly to just ensure that you have data coming and going, like coming and pulling back and pulling up and whatnot. And so all we got to do in order to use the local storage API is to just call these functions to get and set the items. I think they showed them down here. Did they show? So yeah, there's a couple of different functions that we can call in order to work with the local storage functions, right? One is the get item function that allows us to check and get items from local storage if we know the key. But the one that we need to be able to use first clearly would be the set item, which allows us to set a new item with a particular key name and value to essentially save the string of data that we want to save, right? So right now we have this really dope array of strings in our messages that, in our dashboard of messages, right, that we might want to save, right? And those strings all, as the user's adding them, right, to our array, right, as we're setting those messages, we might also want to save those messages and pull them back up for later use, right? So what would be cool is after I set these messages here, it would be dope if I could save the messages locally, right? So I can draw back from them. And then I'm gonna want some way to actually, when the application loads or when this component loads, I'm gonna want some way to essentially pull the data out of local storage and set the state, right? Because if I save it, I want to load it and basically have it so that when the component first loads, all this information is actually coming back from local storage and not necessarily just being hard coded like this each time. So thankfully, the local storage API and the way React works makes both of these scenarios very easy for us to handle. So I'm going to just throw one more comment in here, just say, find a way to load the data when the component first renders, right? So first thing I want to do is I want to save these messages locally, right? So remember, we can just use the local storage functions in order to do this. Local storage dot and then set item, right? Set item takes one item and it has to be a string. Well, we have this array. So how are we going to be able to take this array of data and store it in a way that is tied to a particular string or tied to just a string, right? So what's cool about this is actually a great opportunity for us to talk about a couple concepts that are going to be very important when we start talking about some of the newer concepts coming up, right? So the first thing that we got to know is that we can turn all of the JavaScript objects that we're working with, this array, these strings, etc., into a string very easily by using a particular another API in the JavaScript library that is called JSON, the JSON interface, right? And so the JSON object basically represents JSON is a shorthand for what we call, so we say JSON, but it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And JavaScript Object Notation, if for anyone that works with JavaScript, is just basically the fact that we can store the data in an object that we could represent in JavaScript. So remember, objects are these curly brace things with key value pairs, right? And commas, etc., right? So JSON is literally just objects notations in JavaScript that allow for us to represent data in this object format with key value pairs, right? So what's cool about the JSON data type is that we use it all the time in the web, right? And even beyond the web, in mobile as well, right? Sending data from application to application. JSON is a very standard type of data that gets sent from different applications to other applications. And when we start working with APIs, it's very common that the APIs that you might be working with are going to use JSON as the data type of value. So it's cool that we can introduce some of what JSON is, and also some of the library functions that are inside of JSON, which include a number of different functions that we can use commonly to support us working with JSON. So one of them that clearly we might want to use is this stringify function, which basically says it converts a JavaScript value to a JavaScript object notation string. So it takes any JavaScript value, right? Usually an object or an array, right? And turns it into a string. So we can actually use this function to serve as a part of our equation for set item, right? So set item takes in a key that is going to represent the data we're saving. So the key I'm going to use right now, let's just say messages. And then the value we're going to have to pass is, we're going to JSON.stringify, and stringify our messages, right? So the messages, the messages that are in our array, in our state, right? And so, matter of fact, since a little bit of it was bugging a little bit, I'm still gonna pass this new messages array, right? Because this is the most updated version of this array right now, right? So so basically right now we have local storage setting this item of messages, right? And we're creating a string out of this array and saving it now in local storage with this key messages. So that's dope, because now, and let me just do a little console.log, and then I think let me do a console.log and say save to local storage messages. Cool. So if I go back to our app, I don't know why this draw is tweaking like this. I cannot wait to figure that out. Let me just do this real quick. Refresh. Go in here. So new message from form. All right, that's cool. And then we go here. And as you can see, we get this console log saved to local storage. Clearly, it's saving it with that message that we had before. So that's great. Still don't know what that bug is, why it's not showing up on our form, but we'll figure that out. But clearly, we're saving the data and that's working well. So now let's test that it's working by doing the last step, which is we need to find a way to load the data when the component first renders, right? So this is interesting because this is actually a very important concept in React that I'm glad that we have an opportunity to touch on real quick right before we end today's session, which is how do we respond to different parts of the component lifecycle, right? So when I say the component lifecycle, I basically mean whenever the component gets first shown on the screen, whenever a component is getting updated, whenever a component is being taken away from the screen, right? Those are all life cycle events in the component, in the like kind of the span of our component existing on our DOM. We want ways to basically know, hey, when are these different things taking place in our component? And it turns out that in React, we have the ability to leverage that logic by using one other hook in React that is very important. So here they're showing us all the built-in React hooks. I'm glad they're showing this really quickly. The state hook that we're used to using just now is the use state hook. But there's another hook that we can use in order to essentially understand what's going on inside of a component at different times and essentially when those different changes in the component lifecycle are happening, when a component is being updated, when it's being first rendered, when it's being shown on the DOM, and when it's being taken away from the DOM, right? This use effect hook is the hook that gets called when those different aspects of the component's lifecycle are being triggered, right? So the use effect hook is a very important hook. We use it often when basically, when component first loads and you want to have some, you want to have your component kind of do some actions when that component first loads, or if data changes and you want your component to respond to data changing, and hey, like maybe some data's changed in our app, we want it to render or whatnot, right? We can use the use effect hook in order to do this. And essentially the use effect hook basically works like a callback function for our component and how it gets structured. And there's a couple of parameters in it. The first big parameter is kind of just like the function with the logic we want to have happen. And the second is this idea of dependencies, which are essentially, these are values that might be in our props or in our state or whatnot that that the hook might be responding to. So it's like essentially what data might this hook be tied to. So you'll see different, as you start looking at the use effect hook, you'll see different situations where people are using it. We can call this hook, just like we can call the use state hook as many times as we need for as many state values we need. We can call the use effect hook similarly for as many pieces of information we want the use effect hook to track. It's a pretty interesting hook, but it's also one of the more complicated ones, in my opinion, because sometimes it's hard to understand fully when does it get called and why, right? But I like to think about it like when you want your component, when things are changing within your component, and you want essentially a way to track those changes to your component and essentially run some code in those changes, the use effect hook is the hook that we use. So one of the changes that happen in a component is when it first is loading or when it's first mounting on the DOM. So we can actually use the use effect hook in order to track that particular moment and and create some logic that will pull the data that we are talking about, right? Pull that data that we just saved to local storage and save it in our state, right? So to prove this point, let's try this. Let's make this state empty for now. Cool. So the state here is empty. And then what I want to do is when the component first loads, I want to set the state to have the messages from local storage. So I'm gonna call it use effect, and use effect takes in a function to be called whenever the the effect is noted. It's kind of set up a little bit like this. This is kind of where we would create our logic, or you could say setup. And then here in this array is where you have, if you have specific dependencies, you track those there. For right now, all I want to do is when the component first loads, I want this use effect hook to be called so that we can pull the data from our local storage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, let's grab these messages, right? Those messages are going to, let's call it save messages, just so it's a little bit easier to see. Save messages, right? Well, we're going to call local storage, right? .get item, right? And we got to pass in the key that we used before. So we passed in a key called messages. So in local storage get item, I'm going to pass that same key. Whoops. I'm going to pass messages, right? But what this returns is a string, right? Clearly the string is a string of, we made it a string because we had to save it as a string, but we want it to be an array. So one thing I can do is use the JSON library one more time to parse the string and turn it back into a JavaScript object. So I'm going to actually do that real quick and just kind of JSON parse the data that gets back from here. So this big blob that I just highlighted is going to be some data saved as a string, right, in the local storage. By calling JSON.parse in it, we're turning it back into a JavaScript object, which means that the array that was turned into a string will turn back into a regular array. And then we should be able to set the state if this exists, right? So what's important to note is that if the item doesn't exist in local storage, it's not going to break. It's just going to return null. So we're going to want to make sure we check that there's some data there. And if there is, then we can set the state. Otherwise, we'll set the state to null, and that's not what we want, right? So I just want to check to see if save messages, I could do something like bang equals null like this, or I could just say if save messages, which essentially says the same thing. If save messages is basically saying if this data exists, if it's not null, right? If it's not null, what I want to do then is set our messages to the save messages. And this should allow for us to have the flow that we're expecting to have with pulling this data when the component first loads, right? So if we save this, and then what I want to do also, let's just say, before we set it, let's just say, loaded messages, save messages, cool, and go back to our app, and I'll refresh this. Remember, I had already I took out that hard-coded stuff. So all this data is coming back from the saved data, right? So here, loaded messages was called a couple times, so you can see, right? So here, one more time, I'm going to say last one to save, submit this. Again, I got to figure out why that John isn't working, but if I refresh right now, and go back into our stuff, right? So the save worked. We're saving the data to local storage and we're able to pull it back, which is great. So now we have the messages working like we would expect a real application to work. We're saving some data and using React to make all of that possible. So I know I got a little bug I got to fix. I'm going to fix it. I'm Bugmaster Cam. That's what we do. But yeah, hopefully this is helpful to see the logic of how we send and transfer the data between our components. If you found it helpful, just give me a